We all kind of assume that the presidential candidate rolling in dough has a golden ticket to the nomination, right?
Yeah, that's the common wisdom.
But the 2008 Republican primaries threw a fascinating wrench in that whole idea.
Definitely did.
The guy who ultimately won wasn't the early fundraising champion, not by a long shot. Okay, let's unpack this surprising dynamic.
Sounds good.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into the campaign finances of the four key Republican contenders back then: John McCain, Mitt Romney, Mike Huckabee, and Ron Paul.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, you've given us this analysis of the campaign finance data, the stuff reported to the Federal Election Commission, the FEC Plus summaries from nonpartisan groups.
Right.
And we're really zeroing in on that primary period up to about, say, March 31st, 2008.
Okay.
Our mission really is to understand how the money or, the lack of it influenced how these campaigns were run, their viability, their strategies.
And ultimately, how far could that money actually take them? What were the limits?
Precisely.
So, looking at the big picture first, the 2008 Republican primaries, there was a massive amount of money involved overall.
Huge sums, yes.
But what really stands out is the sheer gulf, the difference between what the top candidates managed to raise during that crucial primary period.
What's fascinating there is just how dominant Romney was financially right at the start.
Yeah, tell us about that.
By March 31st, 2008, he'd pulled together something like $111 million.
Wow. $111 million that early.
Yeah, it really put him in a different league financially compared to the others, especially in those initial stages.
A huge chunk of that was his own cash, wasn't it?
A very significant chunk. The numbers vary slightly depending on the source, but somewhere between $35 million and maybe $45 million in personal contributions and loans.
So that's like, what, over 40%?
Roughly 42% of his total receipts, yeah. It gave him an enormous head start.
Okay, some personal money, and what else?
He also relied heavily on large individual donations. Those accounted for about 48% of his funding.
Almost half.
Yep. But here's where it gets really interesting, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
The small individual donations, under $200.
Yeah.
Only about 8% of his total. Very low.
Mm-hmm. And PAC money, political action committees.
Almost nothing. Less than 1%.
Okay, so that financial profile, lots of personal wealth, big donors, not much small dollar stuff. What does that tell us about his campaign?
Well, it really points to a more traditional kind of establishment-style campaign structure.
Right.
He tapped into networks of wealthy donors and, crucially, used his own significant resources to build this powerful financial base right out of the gate.
Which allowed him to do what, strategically?
It allowed him to spend early and spend heavily.
Yeah.
Especially on advertising in those critical early states like Iowa and New Hampshire.
Trying to build name recognition fast.
Exactly. And gain that early momentum. The FEC data shows, for instance, a lot of his early ad money went into TV spots in places like Des Moines and Cedar Rapids, maybe aiming for an older demographic there.
And he definitely spent big. You said he raised $111 million by March. Did he spend it all?
Pretty much. By the end of March, his campaign had already shelled out nearly $111 million.
Okay, but as we know, being the biggest spender, well, it doesn't automatically mean you win.
Not at all.
So if he had this massive financial advantage, why didn't he lock up the nomination?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Or maybe the $111 million question here.
Right.
It really highlights that money isn't the only factor, maybe not even the ultimate deciding factor. Which brings us, I think, to John McCain. His financial journey was completely different.
Oh man, talk about a financial roller coaster for McCain. Mid-2007, things looked dire, right?
Absolutely. Serious money troubles, reports of funding shortages, organizational shakeups. It really looked like his campaign might be, on the ropes.
Yeah, real jeopardy.
Yeah.
But then things turned around.
Dramatically.
Yeah.
Those early primary victories started happening, New Hampshire, South Carolina.
And suddenly the money started flowing in?
Exactly. By May 2008, his total primary fundraising hit around $122 million. But it's crucial to remember, like you said, the timing. By the end of 2007, he'd only raised about $42 million and spent most of it, around $39 million.
So the wins really were the trigger for the cash.
There's a fascinating direct link there. Those wins in New Hampshire, South Carolina, Florida, they sent a powerful signal to donors.
Like, okay, this guy can actually win.
Precisely. They saw him as viable, as electable, and the contributions followed. He also relied heavily on large individual contributions, similar to Romney in that respect.
Did he get PAC money too?
He did get some support from PACs, yes. And another key point, he opted out of public financing for the primary.
Which is a big decision, yeah. You give up the federal matching funds.
But you aren't bound by those strict spending limits that come with it.
And for McCain, it seems like that gamble paid off. He won the nomination despite that really rough financial start.
It did. It raises an interesting point, though, about those donors who came in after the wins. Were they the same people who were hesitant before? Or was it a totally new wave?
Good question.
I suspect it was likely a mix. Some early believers probably doubled down, increased their support. But those victories definitely brought in a whole new group of donors, people who've been sitting on the sidelines, waiting to see who emerged as a serious contender.
Yeah, momentum. It creates this feedback loop, doesn't it? Electorally and financially.
A very powerful one in politics.
Absolutely. Okay, now let's shift gears completely. Ron Paul.
Yes, Ron Paul. A whole different fundraising story.
Totally different category. He raised about, $34.4 million by March 31st, 2008?
Around that, yes. And that number was actually pretty consistent with his total fundraising for the entire election cycle.
And this wasn't big donors or personal wealth, right? This was grassroots.
Very much so. Driven by a really dedicated online grassroots movement. The figures on his small individual contributions are just remarkable.
How remarkable?
Well, estimates put it somewhere between 39% and maybe even up to 63% of his total funds coming in donations of $200 or less.
Wow, 63% potentially. That's incredible. That's a huge proportion coming from just lots and lots of regular people.
It really is. And those money bombs, you remember those?
Oh, yeah, the big online fundraising days.
Those coordinated pushes generated massive amounts online. They really captured the imagination.
What was it about his message, do you think? Why did it connect so strongly with so many individual contributors online?
Well, his message, libertarian-leaning, strong stance against the Iraq War, focus on the Constitution, it clearly tapped into a significant group of people who felt perhaps disenfranchised by the more mainstream Republican candidates.
And the internet gave him a direct line to them.
A very powerful platform. He could connect directly, bypass traditional media to some extent, and mobilize them financially in a way that was quite new at the time.
And it certainly worked for fundraising. I mean, $34.4 million is not insignificant.
Not at all.
But, and this is the crucial bit, all that fundraising success, all that online enthusiasm, it didn't translate into any primary wins. Not a single state.
Right. And that really highlights the point that having a lot of enthusiastic supporters, even if they open their wallets, doesn't automatically equal electoral victory, especially in the state-by-state grind of the primary system.
It shows that grassroots money is powerful, but you still need broader appeal. You need to win delegates.
Exactly. That support needs to translate into votes in diverse states and different kinds of contests. Caucuses versus open primaries, closed primaries. It's complex.
Okay, so that brings us to the fourth guy, Mike Huckabee.
Right, and Huckabee operated in yet another different financial universe, especially compared to someone like Romney.
Definitely the underdog, financially speaking. How much did he raise by that March cutoff?
Only by $16.3 million. And that was pretty much his total for the whole cycle, too.
So way less than the others.
Significantly less. He did get a bit of a bump in donations after his surprise win in the Iowa caucus, though.
Iowa. We'll come back to that. Where did his money come from? Also, small donors.
Primarily individual contributions, yes. And it's very likely a significant chunk of that came from evangelical Christian voters, which was his core demographic.
That makes sense.
He also did something the others didn't. Besides Ron Paul, maybe he accepted some federal matching funds, about $1.6 million.
Okay, so she took the public money.
Which again comes with spending limits. His strategy was clearly about trying to capitalize on momentum from any early state wins, like Iowa, hoping that success would spark more donations, leading to more wins.
That chicken and egg thing again. Wins bring money. Money helps win.
Exactly. Those early contests are both electoral battles and crucial fundraising signals.
And he did get that early success in Iowa. Huge surprise win.
Massive upset.
But as the primaries moved on to bigger states, more expensive states,
his limited financial resources really became a major hurdle. He just didn't have the financial firepower to compete effectively on advertising or organization in those later, larger contests.
It really makes you wonder, though. If he'd had more money after Iowa, could he have kept that momentum going?
It's a great counterfactual. More resources certainly would have let him compete more effectively in bigger media markets, build a larger ground game in later states.
But maybe his appeal was always more regional?
That's also possible. It's true, his message and appeal had a particular resonance, especially in the South, and with evangelical voters. Broader success might have required a different kind of campaign, maybe even a slightly different message, regardless of funding.
This really brings us to a crucial point. That interplay between the money and the actual results in those critical early states.
Yes, let's break those down.
Okay, so Iowa. First caucus, Huckabee wins.
With relatively low spending.
And he beats Romney.
Who poured a ton of money into Iowa. Remember those TV ads we mentioned?
Yeah.
Des Moines, Cedar Rapids.
Right. So how did Huckabee pull it off?
Well, Romney was spending on broad reach TV. Huckabee, with his limited funds, focused more on grassroots efforts, leveraging local church networks, really connecting personally. And in a caucus format, that kind of organization and personal touch can be incredibly effective.
So it wasn't just how much they spent, but how they spent it and who they were reaching.
Exactly. Iowa was a perfect example of money not being the deciding factor. Message, resonance, and organization mattered more there.
Okay, next up, New Hampshire. Different state, different result.
Right. McCain wins New Hampshire. He had moderate spending, but crucially, he had momentum coming off better than expected showings, and maybe just his general narrative.
And again, he beat Romney.
He beat Romney, who again spent very heavily in New Hampshire.
So what worked for McCain there?
His appeal to independent voters was key in New Hampshire's primary. And that compelling comeback story, the campaign that was left for dead, suddenly surging that narrative, seemed to carry more weight than Romney's ads.
Okay, so money wasn't decisive in Iowa or New Hampshire, really. Then Michigan.
Michigan was different. Romney won there.
Finally, a win for the big spender.
Yes. He spent heavily, but he also had local ties there. His father was governor. McCain came in second.
So maybe in Michigan, the money combined with those local factors did make the difference, more traditional primary state.
It seems that way. The spending, plus the local connection, yielded a victory for him there.
Then South Carolina.
Back to McCain. Another win for him, again with sort of moderate spending. South Carolina has an open primary.
Meaning non-Republicans could vote.
Exactly. Which likely helped McCain again with his cross-party appeal. The momentum just kept building for him.
And finally, Florida. Big state. Expensive.
Very expensive media markets in Florida. And this was a crucial contest. McCain won it.
Did money matter more there?
It seems likely. Both McCain and Romney spent significant amounts in Florida. It suggests that in these larger states where reaching voters through expensive media is more necessary, resources become more critical.
But it wasn't just money for McCain, right? Didn't he get a big endorsement?
Yes, a key endorsement from the then-Governor Charlie Crist. That likely played a significant role in swaying voters alongside the spending.
Okay, so that sets the stage. After those early contests, we hit Super Tuesday and beyond. How did things shake out then, with fundraising starting to catch up for McCain?
Well, as you said, McCain's fundraising had significantly recovered by then. That allowed him to compete effectively across the board on Super Tuesday and later.
And he won the most states.
He won the most states, 9 on Super Tuesday alone, and crucially, the most delegates. That really solidified his path to the nomination.
What about Romney? He still had a lot of money.
He did, and he actually won 11 states overall through the primaries. But he couldn't secure wins in some of those key larger primaries, often losing narrowly to McCain. Despite his financial advantage, he eventually withdrew.
And Huckabee, after Iowa.
Huckabee managed to win 5 southern states, mostly on Super Tuesday, where his evangelical base was strong. But he just didn't have the resources to mount a truly national challenge beyond that.
And Ron Paul, all that money.
Still no state wins. Significant fundraising, passionate support, but 0 wins in the delegate count.
So when you look at that whole picture, it really does seem like a very imperfect correlation between money raised or spent and actually winning.
Extremely imperfect. You have Romney, the biggest fundraiser and spender, who didn't win.
Right. Then McCain, who started with serious money problems, but won through those strategic victories and building momentum.
Exactly. Then Paul, with impressive grassroots funding, but no electoral success in terms of wins.
And Huckabee, the lowest fundraiser, who had that early success in Iowa but couldn't sustain it financially.
It really forces you to look beyond the dollars and cents.
So what were those key factors beyond finance that seemed to make the difference in 2008?
Well, for McCain, his long experience in Washington and this widespread perception that he was the most electable candidate against the likely Democratic nominee, Barack Obama, that was huge.
The electability argument.
Definitely. Also, as we discussed, those strategic early wins were critical for building unstoppable momentum. Momentum that, frankly, money alone couldn't buy for Romney.
What else?
You also have to consider the weaknesses of his opponents at various stages and how the conservative vote sometimes split between candidates like Romney and Huckabee, potentially benefiting McCain.
Right. The dynamics between the candidates themselves.
And don't underestimate the power of media narratives. McCain's comeback story got a lot of attention. Plus, key endorsements like Creased in Florida can really matter in close contests.
So, boiling it all down, what are the big takeaways here? What did we really learn about money's role from the '08 GOP race?
Okay, I think there are a few key things. First, money clearly acts as a critical threshold for viability. You need enough to get off the ground, run a basic campaign, be taken seriously.
Triple states, basically.
Exactly. But second, we saw pretty clear diminishing returns on excessive spending. Pouring more and more money in, like Romney did, didn't guarantee victory. There is a limit to what just pure financial saturation can achieve.
Okay.
What else? Third, looking at where the money comes from, Romney's big donors versus Paul's small donors versus Huckabee's base. It tells you a lot about the candidate's support structure and maybe the kind of campaign they're running.
The fundraising source as a signal.
Yes. Fourth, the relationship between money and winning is dynamic. It's that feedback loop. Early wins fuel fundraising, which enables more campaigning, potentially leading to more wins. It's not static.
And the final piece.
Ultimately, the effectiveness of the candidate's message and how voters actually receive it on the ground, that seems absolutely critical. It can clearly outweigh even a significant financial advantage sometimes.
So, to sum it all up then, money, yeah, it's essential. You can't run without it, really.
Absolutely essential.
But it was clearly not the sole deciding factor in the 2008 GOP primary. Not even close, maybe.
Not even close. Strategy, candidate, appeal, that connection with voters,
Yeah.
and that incredibly powerful, almost intangible force of momentum.
Yeah, momentum.
Those played exceptionally significant roles in deciding who ultimately got the nomination.
Okay, that's a great summary. It really complicates the simple money wins elections idea.
It does, and it raises a fascinating question maybe for you to think about after this. Looking at how 2008 unfolded, these dynamics between money, message, momentum, how might they play out in future elections? Especially when you think about how campaign finance rules keep changing or not changing, and the continued rise of online small dollar fundraising that we saw with Paul, but now it's even bigger.
Yeah, that's changed so much.
So what non-financial factors, things like candidate personality, media environment, unexpected world events, what might become even more critical in shaping who rises to the top in the years ahead?
That's a really interesting thought to end on. What else besides money will drive these outcomes? Something to definitely chew on.